you gotten a warm drink in your hand, I thought, why not go through one of the most gory, disturbing books in the Bible together as a treat for us. So I'm only kidding. Judges is an incredible book. It's incredibly hopeful. But this morning, just really quickly want to say welcome to those of you who are part of winter camp. It's good to see you guys again. We've been spending the last couple of days together. Yep. And Friday night, Saturday, and then today. And also it's good to see the leaders are still alive and well too. You look mostly awake, those of you I see out here this morning. So as we are in Judges, because we usually go through entire books of the Bible at a time, I want to catch you up to the story and kind of where we're at so far. So Judges is, of course, the 7th book in the Bible. And up to this point, if we go back to the very beginning, we're almost to the beginning. In Genesis chapter 12, we read of a man named Abraham. And God gives Abraham a promise. He says, Abraham, listen to this. I'm going to bless people who bless you. I'm going to curse people who curse you. And through you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Now, sitting at history from our vantage point, we recognize that the earth was blessed through Abraham by the work and person of Jesus Christ. And so we live at that part of the story. But if we go back to the Old Testament, much of it is about this line as it progresses through history. And so we track along with the descendants of Abraham, who are the Israelites. And they make their way into Egypt and find themselves in bondage and in slavery. They find themselves struggling, and they're liberated by the mighty works of God. And He provides for them in the wilderness, and He brings them into the land of Canaan. And so the book of Judges is this 350-year period between the conquest of Canaan and the establishment of King Saul and the monarchy. And so that's the period that's being covered. Now Judges gives us the theme of the book toward the end of Judges, but it's repeated constantly. It begins in 17, and then it's the final words in Judges chapter 21, verse 25. And this is what those words are. An entire book summed up, themed in just one verse. This is what it says. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. That is the theme of the book. Now, our passage this morning is a second introduction to the book of Judges, but it will serve as kind of an entire summary of what takes place throughout the book. And so there's two truths that we need to remember as we get into this text. And there's probably two truths that we need to remember as we read Judges, or the entire Bible for that matter. Number one, we have to realize and understand the incredible bent and grip that sin has on the human heart. And number two, in spite of that, we must remember the divine miracle of God's mercy and His grace in the face of that sin. So let's read our text together this morning. We're going to be in Judges 2:6, reading all the way to Judges chapter 3, verse 6. Here's what it says. When Joshua dismissed the people of Israel went each to his inheritance to take possession of the land. And the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great work that the Lord had done for Israel. And Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110 years. And they buried him within the boundaries of his inheritance in Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of the mountain of Gaash. And all that generation also were gathered to their fathers. And there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work He had done for Israel. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them and bowed down to them. And they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and He gave them over to plunderers who plundered them. And He sold them into the hand of their surrounding enemies, so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned, and as the Lord had sworn to them. And they were in terrible distress. Then the Lord raised up judges, who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen to their judges, for they whored after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their fathers had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord, and they did not do so. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who afflicted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they turned back and were more corrupt than their fathers, going after other gods, serving them and bowing down to them. They did not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And he said, because this people has transgressed my covenant that I commanded their fathers, and have not obeyed my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died, in order to test Israel by them, whether they will take care to walk in the way of the Lord as their fathers did, or not. So the Lord left those nations, not driving them out quickly, and he did not give them into the hand of Joshua. Now these are the nations that the Lord left, to test Israel by them. That is, all in Israel who had not experienced all the wars in Canaan. It was only in order that the generations of the people of Israel might know war, to teach war to those who had not known it before. These are the nations, the 5 lords of the Philistines, and all the Canaanites, and the Sidonians, and the Hivites who lived on Mount Lebanon, from Mount Baal Hermon as far as Lebo Hamath. They were for the testing of Israel, to know whether Israel would obey the commandments of the Lord which he commanded their fathers by the hand of Moses. So the people of Israel lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And their daughters they took to themselves for wives, and their own daughters they gave to their sons, and they served their gods. Let's pray together this morning. Jesus, we are thankful for your word. We're so glad to be together as a church this morning. We ask, Holy Spirit, that you would open our ears and open our hearts to receive from you this morning. In your name, amen. So, like many of you out here who are parents, my wife and I, we want to take our parenting very seriously. And for us, success as a parent, we go, okay, we want to train our kids. We want the outcome to be, we want them to love God and love the church. That's important to us. But beyond that, we want to raise healthy citizens that contribute to society. That's important, right? And so one of the things we've been trying to teach them is this idea of perseverance. If in life you're going to have repeated failures, and then you'll eventually achieve success, but you've got to push through a lot of things in order to achieve that success. And so in-home schooling has been really a great testing ground for that, for them. And so it's one of the things that I've done with them is I've said, hey, when you face challenges and hard things, I want you to say, I've got this. And so my 5-year-old son, Des, the other day, he was putting together a Lego set. And this is a challenging thing for a 5-year-old. It's a challenging thing for a 32-year-old as well, okay? Let's just get that out there. But he reached a part where he was a bit frustrated and kind of upset, and he threw his arms up and said, that's it, I quit. And in my wisest dad voice I could muster, I said, Des, what do we say when we have to do challenging things? And here I am anxiously and eagerly awaiting my parenting wisdom to be parroted back to me by my 5-year-old. And Des just sighs and goes, maybe next time, Dad. It's not quite what I was hoping for in that moment. And what we see here, thinking of that, is this generation that has been taught something by the preceding generation that has been given this task to accomplish, and collectively, together, they've just looked at the challenge and went, maybe next time. You see, their parents had set them up for success with the conquest of most of the land of Canaan. They'd been given many of the best parts of the land. They said, now it's up to you to finish the job. These enemies that lived kind of on the outskirts and kind of on the margins, as a generation, instead of taking on the mantle and completing the task, what they did together was say, you know what? Let's just live and let live. Maybe next time. And it was that mantra and it was that thought process which led to a national history that was a continual downward spiral toward their own demise and destruction. In the book of Judges, many of you who are reading through your Bibles, maybe you're coming up on the book and you'll see a repeated pattern. And commentators call it the judge's cycle, but what I want to call it is the judge's spiral, because it's not just staying static in one spot, it's continually moving downward. And we see the stages of this. We see the rebellion of the people. We see oppression by other nations. The people groan and cry out to God, and God will send salvation in the form of a judge and rescue, and then the land will be at peace and they'll have rest. And that will last for a time, and then the cycle starts all over again. And so we see this generation, at one point, this generation, they are conquerors. They are victors. But in only a short span, they go to barely hanging on, and we go, how in the world did this happen? And what we see here is a picture of faithless people. The first thing we learn from our text this morning is this: faithless people forget to remember. They forget to remember. In the beginning of our text, in chapter 2, verse 6 through 9, we see the great example of Joshua. Now, Joshua has already passed on at this point, but it's kind of giving us a flashback to who he was and what his generation had accomplished. Joshua will serve for us as the great yardstick of the book of Judges. And we see that he was a servant of the Lord, and he had the incredible privilege that none of the previous leaders of Israel had. Not Moses, not Jacob, not any of those men had the privilege of being buried in the land of their inheritance when they died. This is what happened for Joshua. The first generation, which spells out here, these people who were contemporaries of Joshua and some who outlived them, they were marked by two things. Number one, they served the Lord in verse 7. And number two, we see in verse 6 that they took possession of the land which had been given them. Notice the unique language there, that the land had been given to them by God. It was now up to them to take possession. But then we see in verse 10 what is a haunting verse for us to read. It's a hinge verse for our entire passage this morning. It says, "There arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work he had done for Israel." It's as if things are moving along gracefully and as they're supposed to, and then all of a sudden they come to a screeching halt. It's like you're reading a record scratch right there. I was reminded of my friend Jay Oakes. Many of you know Jay in India. They're wonderful people. They're members of our church, and Jay served as youth pastor here for years and years, and Jay does a lot of things that I would never do, and that probably says more about me than it does about him, but he took his bike out jumping a couple years ago, like on these dirt jumps, and he shared a video of this a couple weeks ago on Facebook, and then I was thinking of this verse, and I was reminded of that video, and I got his permission to share it with you this morning. So I just want you to watch this 13 seconds and enjoy it real quick. Just for the record, he's fine, okay? He's still recovering 7 years later. We think he's fine, but, and let that be a lesson. If you're younger, always wear your helmet, okay? But there's an internet meme out there with the title "How It Started," kind of how it's going. Maybe you've seen those. So I see that in this text right here. How it started, things were going fantastically, they were going swimmingly, and then all of a sudden, this happened, right? They face planted into the jump. Like, oh my goodness, there was a generation who did not know the Lord or the work that you better take that down, Jake. I can't look at that for much longer. Like, it's, oof. It makes me uncomfortable. It hurts my spine to look at that. So there arose a generation who did not know the Lord. Things came unraveled pretty fast. And the word "know" there is not just intellectual knowledge. We're not talking about this comprehensive knowledge of who God is and what he was like. Because we have a pretty basic confidence that this group of people understood the stories from the past. They lived in a culture that passed down these stories and these traditions audibly from generation to generation. But that word "know" there, remember that it's much more than intellectual knowledge. We see it used in Genesis chapter 4, verse 1, when Adam knew his wife. It's not an intellectual thing there, it's an experiential thing. So while they had an intellectual knowledge of the divine acts of mercy provided to the nation by God, from rescuing them from slavery in Egypt, from providing a way for them to the land, and then the conquering of the land itself, these saving acts of a mighty God they knew about, but they were no longer precious or central to them. So in other words, these people forgot. And we can see this not just modeled in this generation right here, but throughout history. If you were to rewind and go back to maybe your high school days when you learned about the Pilgrims coming over on the Mayflower. In 1620, they came over, and if you can remember, the Pilgrims, they were also called Puritans, and they were trying to escape from persecution and wanted to be able to practice freedom of religion over here on these shores. And so these were people who gave up everything to go to an unknown world so they could have freedom of religion to practice how they wanted. And by and large, they achieved that. But what happens is one generation gives way to the next. And now their children are in positions of leadership and in positions of authority, and they haven't had the same experiences their parents had. And in the year 1655, America began to see many Quakers come to its eastern shores, and Quakers held the same ideals as Puritans, but to a much more extreme level, and so all of a sudden there's opposition taking place. And much more than opposition is the Puritans, who largely outnumbered these Quakers, began to persecute these people. The very same thing they'd come to these shores to avoid, now they're meeting out on people who are different than they are. And this kind of persecution climaxed in the hanging of 4 men between the years 1659 to 1661. D.A. Carson, talking about this idea of generations, he says, one generation accepts the gospel, the next generation assumes it, the next confuses it, and the next loses it. And we read this and we ask the question, all right, who's to blame here? We got to figure this out. We got to pin the blame on somebody for this big miss. Is it the parents' generation? Or is it the younger generation? And probably, friends, the answer here is both. Let's remind ourselves of some things we know about parenting, about salvation from the Bible. Number one, parents hold the primary responsibility for the spiritual formation of their children. If you're here this morning and you're a parent and you're a Christian, I probably don't need to remind you of the incredible importance and at times burden of your task. This is what God tells through Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 11, speaking to the nation of Israel. You shall therefore lay up these words of mine in your heart and in your soul, and you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall teach them to your children, talking of them when you are sitting in your house, and when you are walking by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall write them in the doorposts of your house and on your gates, that your days and the days of your children may be multiplied in the land that the Lord swore to your fathers to give them, as long as the heavens are above the earth. What this verse isn't necessarily directing us to do is to establish nightly devotions. That may be part of it, and that's a good thing to have as a family, but it's a much more comprehensive vision than that. This is encouraging you to let the gospel make its way into the cracks of your life. That this is not something that just exists on the margin. Notice the language. As you sit down, as you're walking, as you rise up, as you go to bed. That means in the course of your daily, regular, mundane schedule, gospel conversations must take place. It must be a thing that's talked about on a regular basis in your family that doesn't just exist on Sundays. Parents, can I tell you a great way to model the gospel for your children is not just to teach them wisdom. That is one of the ways. Children, your parents know more things than you do. Yeah, right. A little too excited about that one. But parents, let me tell you this. If you are a Christian and you are in the process of being sanctified, of becoming more and more like Jesus every day, doesn't it stand to reason that there are parts of you that don't look like Jesus just yet? And wouldn't it make sense that sometimes that manifests itself towards your children? There are mistakes that you make as a parent. One of the best ways for our kids to see the gospel at work in us is for us to ask forgiveness of our kids when we act wrongly, when we behave poorly. It's the gospel modeled in us and through us to our children. It must not stay on the margins. It must become a part of regular conversations of your family. Secondly, you may be here thinking, I don't have kids, I'm off the hook. Not quite. Every Christian has a responsibility to share the gospel with the next generation. This is what Paul wrote to the church in Corinth in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. He said, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures." The gospel being shared was of first importance to the Apostle Paul. The value of what people are doing, men and women, right now in this moment for our children is almost incalculable, friends. I am so thankful and grateful for men and women who are making a difference in the lives of my kid each and every single week, shoring up their foundation, stoking the flames of love they have for Christ, week in and week out, month after month, year after year. It's why as a church together, we mapped out what we're believing God for in the next 10 years. We did it last year. And one of the things we said is that we want 33% of our average Sunday morning attendance serving in our family life ministry in some capacity. That's from birth to 18 years old. Why did we do that? Why do we want one of every 3 people serving in that capacity? Because we believe that every Christian has a responsibility to share the gospel to the next generation. And we know that if it ends with us, we're in trouble. And we actually haven't done what we're supposed to do. The third truth that we have to remember about this is this: every individual is responsible for their own relationship with God. And Paul mentions this in Romans, that people have clearly seen God. They've been exposed to things about him, and they're without excuse. I know that there are those of us here who have adult children who are wayward, who are not making the best decisions at this moment in their lives. We know that you've spent hours in prayer and you spent tearful nights and nights that have kept you awake. Friends, continue to pray, but remember this: that story is not over. Don't shut that book halfway through. Right? There's more to be done. Fourthly, remember this: God is ultimately sovereign over salvation. Jesus says this in John chapter 6:44. "No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him." As parents of children, we are not the Holy Spirit. And we usually bungle things up when we try to play his role in the lives of our kids. Our responsibility is to help them establish a foundation and point them in the right direction. We cannot take them with us. God is sovereign. And so we see this generation who has forgotten. They may have an intellectual knowledge of God, but the experiential is just not there. What becomes of those people? Well, the second thing we see in this text is that faithless people are prone to rebellion. Let's go through verses 11 through 13 again. It says this: "And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and served the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them, and bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth." So if you see that word Baal here, if you've gone through your Old Testament, you've probably seen that scattered throughout the Old Testament. That word Baal was the Canaanite word for Lord, and he sat at the head of the Canaanite pantheon of gods. He was known as a god of storm and fertility, and the people believed that if they worshipped him, he would provide them with abundant crops, livestock, and families. And this is a culture where those are incredibly important central things. You didn't just want to have a mortgage and a wife and 2.5 kids. You wanted to have an abundance of kids. And so this was important and central to what they did. That's why they worshipped Baal. And when we read the word Ashtaroth there, Ashtaroth is the female cohort of Baal. So real quick, let's take a field trip back to ancient Near Eastern culture together. If I am a Canaanite farmer, and I've had a couple of bad years with the harvest, I haven't received quite the yield of crop I was expecting or hoping for, and I'm thinking, man, I got to provide for my family. I don't want to lose this land. I want my family to be set up to thrive, so I've got to figure out this way to coerce this god Baal to notice me and have some favor on me and my land. And so what I would do is I would go to a shrine of Baal and I would engage in sexual activity with a prostitute of Ashtaroth, and the hope was that act would encourage the gods to do their act, which would result in fruitfulness and abundance towards me. There was no trusting of these gods. These gods had to be coerced and persuaded at all times. They didn't drive around with a bumper sticker on their cart that said, "Let go and let Baal," right? It didn't happen. That wasn't a thing. They always had to be active in hoping that by their act and by their actions, these gods could be persuaded to act in their favor. And so we could see it's not a stretch for the Israelite neighbors of these people to go, man, I want my farm to have a lot of crops this year, and I just kind of want to cover all of my bases and take care of all of my things to ensure that my family succeeds. And so all of a sudden they find themselves drifting themselves toward the shrine of Baal just to, cover their bases. And what we see that the people engaged in is the text says they abandoned the Lord, but that abandonment meant engaging in sort of an idolatry buffet. In that there were so many gods for the surrounding cultures: agriculture, love, war, music. It was all over the place. And so based on one's occupation, their interests, their desires, they could accept or reject gods based on all of those things. So Israel engaged in the worship of Yahweh plus. It was Yahweh plus Baal. It was Yahweh plus Ashtaroth, etc., etc. And there's an interesting verse here that says they did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. This is an interesting parallel. What does God say is evil here? Serving idols. It's a different picture than what we usually think when we think of evil. It's much more challenging to us. My wife and I, when we're surfing for something to watch on Netflix, I always come across this documentary called Evil Genius. I haven't seen it, but the cover art, there's a picture of an evil-looking woman. And I look at that and go, yep, there it is. That is evil. It's in your face. It's insidious. It's sinister. But that's not the definition that God uses. If God says that serving idols is the equivalent of evil, then we better get to know what idols are and figure out if they're rooted in our own hearts. So what is idolatry? Number one, the worship of any person or thing besides God. Number two, giving a place of ultimate significance to anything besides God. Thirdly, an intense relationship with something that ultimately leaves us empty and enslaved. So, for example, we just came from our Shift series where Pastor Brent, week in and week out, gave us biblical teaching on money and possessions. One of the functional gods we see in our culture today is materialism. And if you went through the treasure principle, it kind of talked about that in that book a little bit. Where oftentimes we will look at that next purchase, and if I just make that purchase, then ultimately I will be happy and fulfilled. Well, we probably all know from experience what happened when we made that purchase. Maybe it was great for a little bit, but then all of a sudden, there was the next purchase and the next thing. And so for many people, that has become an idol. Number three, remember, it's an intense relationship with something that ultimately leaves us empty and enslaved. And we could agree and see the massive debt that exists across our country and say, yep, that is an idol that has certainly left people visibly enslaved. So idols exist here and now. They're not just something that are confined to the ancient culture or maybe Eastern culture where we go, I don't have a shrine in my house. I don't have any statues around. I don't burn incense. I'm all good. No, there's plenty of functioning idols lurking around right where we are today. So those things, how do we identify these things in our lives? Number one, ask ourselves this: am I willing to do whatever God says about this area? If the answer is no, then there's a chance there's kind of one of those functioning idols lurking in one of the corners of our hearts. Number two, am I willing to accept whatever God sends in this area? And you have a great opportunity to maybe ask the spouse or a trusted friend, talk about this together. Find out where these idols exist. What God says is evil is the worship of these things. Baal and Ashtaroth aren't around anymore. But the idols of materialism, of politics, of self-improvement still exist today. They're not necessarily bad things. They can be good things taken to an extreme. And so we see what happens with the people who engage in idolatry in verses 14 and 15. This is what it says. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them. And he sold them into the hand of their surrounding enemies, so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned, and as the Lord had sworn to them. And they were in terrible distress. Now, I'm just going to be honest with you. Judges chapter 2, verses 14 and 15 has never come across the feed of my daily inspirational verse from Praise 106.5. It hasn't happened yet. I don't know if it's going to in the future. It hasn't existed there. Don't miss the incredible irony in these verses. It's tragic when we read it. The enemies that are oppressing and enslaving these people are the very people whose gods Israel has adopted. If there's ever been a clearer picture of the outcome of idolatry, friends, this is it. And when we read about the anger of God here, this is not some spasmodic outburst of anger where all of a sudden he can't control himself. No, we see God being faithful. This is what was warned in Joshua chapter 23, verses 15 and 16. But just as all the good things that the Lord your God promised concerning you have been fulfilled for you, so the Lord will bring upon you all the evil things until he has destroyed you from off this good land that the Lord your God has given you, if you transgress the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and go serve other gods and bow down to them. Then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and you shall perish quickly from the good land that he has given you. That's what it says in Joshua chapter 23. Verses like this, they sound so intense, they sound so ominous, but friends, what they should give us is a sense of the trustworthiness and faithfulness of God. That no matter what happens, and no matter what we do, God will be faithful to his word. He will be faithful to his word. He is going to do what he said. If God didn't harbor in his heart an intense love for the people of Israel, he wouldn't bother to go through with this. He'd simply wash his hands and go, maybe next time. Maybe we'll try again with some other people. Maybe we'll figure this out another way. Maybe I'll just give up. That's not what happened. And it's in these next verses that we see the effects of this judge's spiral. Take a look at verse 16. It says, Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen to their judges, for they whored after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their fathers had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord, and they did not do so. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning, because those who afflicted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they turned back and were more corrupt than their fathers, going after other gods, serving them and bowing down to them. They did not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways, so the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And he said, Because this people has transgressed my covenant that I commanded their fathers and have not obeyed my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died.
in order to test Israel by them, whether they will take care to walk in the way of the Lord as their fathers did or not. It's in this specific passage of our text this morning that we see this judge's spiral carried out of the rebellion of the people, of the oppression of the surrounding nations, that the people groan, and God sends salvation and rescue. And God would send a judge, and a judge was not like a judge that we have today. These are regional, kind of political, military leaders that God would send to save his people, to rescue them, bring the land back to peace, and then the cycle would start itself all over again. But there's intense language in this specific section. In verse 17, we see this striking, provocative image. In verse 17, according to this verse, what are we doing when we worship other gods? Well, the text says that we're prostituting ourselves. And back then, prostitutes, and often now too, are people whose lives are out of control. People who are desperate. And people who are giving themselves to something without receiving any love or pleasure in return. It is a very clear picture of the results of idolatry. We come into an intense relationship with something that will never care for us or love us in return. That's the difference between the God that we serve and the idols that we are so easily drawn towards. In God, we are more fulfilled than we could ever imagine. Apart from Him, the opposite is true. So what is the end game for such a rebellious people? How does all this come to fruition? Well, the third thing we learn is that faithless people are in danger of ruin. Here's how our text ends, verse 23. So the Lord left those nations, not driving them out quickly, and He did not give them into the hand of Joshua. Now these are the nations that the Lord left to test Israel by them. That is, all in Israel who had not experienced all the wars in Canaan. It was only in order that the generations of the people of Israel might know war, to teach war to those who had not known it before. These are the nations, the 5 lords of the Philistines, and all the Canaanites, and the Sidonians, and the Hivites who lived on Mount Lebanon, from Mount Baal Hermon as far as Lebo Hamath. They were for the testing of Israel, to know whether Israel would obey the commandments of the Lord, which He had commanded their fathers by the hand of Moses. So the people of Israel lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And their daughters they took to themselves for wives, and their own daughters they gave to their sons, and they served their gods. Here, as we end this text this morning, we see God's judgment on His people's half-heartedness. The job still remains half-finished. However, even though God allows the Canaanites to stay because of the people's unfaithfulness, in His sovereignty, He now uses the presence of these very nations to accomplish 2 things. In chapter 3, verse 1, we see that God uses the presence of these other nations to test Israel. You see, the continual presence of an enemy that stands opposed to God forced the people to think about their relationship with Him, their own failures, and the distinctiveness they've been called to. The fact that while they're around other nations, their calling is to be separate. Number 2, we see that God uses the presence of these other nations to teach Israel how to war. Why? Just so they can fight? No. So that they can learn how to be dependent on God in every situation. There's a constant phrase that's used at the beginning of the Bible: the Lord will fight for you. We see it in Exodus chapter 14, verse 14. When God had delivered the Israelites from the Red Sea, He'd parted the waters to provide salvation for them. And it's written in a song of praise. It's written in Deuteronomy, and Joshua reminds the people the same thing. The Lord will fight for you. That's a promise from God. These people are surrounded by idol-worshiping nations, and they are constantly tested. And they face the question, will you obey the Lord's commands? And tragically, we see even a cursory look at Israel's history in the Old Testament tells us that the answer to that question is a constant no. as we see the cycle and the spiral become worse and worse and worse. Because in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone continued to do what was right in their own eyes. And friends, left to our own devices, doing what is right in our own eyes will lead us to ruin. And I don't know about you, but when I end passages like this, usually my mind goes somewhere else. Maybe I think of Israel. How could you be so foolish? In such close proximity to what God has done for you and what He has provided for you, how do you keep making the same mistakes? Maybe your mind drifts a little closer to home and you think, man, this is the problem with the church at large today. If they could only fix this. Or this is what's wrong with our country today. If we would just stop serving these false idols and return to the Lord. And friends, can I tell you, those things are probably partially true. But I want to encourage you to do what I've done. And I've had to face the uncomfortable process of realizing that the book of Judges, and this passage in particular, forces me to look at myself. Because when I read through this, I ask myself, who am I most like in this passage? Who do I most resemble? The answer is not God, that's for sure. I find myself too often chasing after vain pursuits. I find myself too often placing too much emphasis on good things in my life and looking to them for fulfillment and looking to them for, you name it. I'm reminded that I have been the faithless generation that is brought up in this passage. And together, collectively, we've allowed idols to coexist with God in our own hearts. That we've engaged in vain pursuits. That have taken us down roads into places we wish we hadn't gone. And for many, the pain and shame is doubled because deep down we feel like we should have known better. And that's why I've carried this around, and I gave you one this week in your program. It's just a small little mirror. And it reminds me, it's been reminding me, that there's so much chaos surrounding us. There's so many issues going on. But I've got to be reminded that I have been faithless, that I have acted wrongly. And that comes across as bad news, but here's the good news, and it's our big idea this morning. God is faithful, especially when His people are faithless. That language is intentional. It's not in spite of. It's not God is faithful and He tolerates faithless people. No, He's faithful especially in times of our unfaithfulness. It's been demonstrated constantly in this passage and throughout the entire Bible that the overwhelming faithfulness of God shows up in spite of His people's desire to reciprocate it. God's love for us is so great that His response isn't maybe next time. Oh, they messed up again. They failed again. They drifted again. Maybe next time. No, what does God say? He says, I've got this. And He sends His Son to demonstrate His love for us. In those days, in the time of the judges, there was no king. So everyone did what was right in their own eyes. But in these days, we have a king. And the question that we ask is, will we recognize Him as that? See, we're in a very crucial time as a church and as a culture. We've got to ask ourselves, can God be trusted in the midst of my unfaithfulness? Will He remain faithful? The answer is yes. So can we trust Him? Because we know there's a king, will we do what He says
or will we do what is right in our own eyes? We think about this question coming on the heels of our Shift series. We've read about what God expects from us with our money and our possessions. He's laid out guidelines for us and principles for us that if we follow will lead to our benefit. Will we do what the King says, or will we do what was right in our own eyes? Looking forward to the coming weeks, we're going to be getting into our To Be Human series. We're going to be learning about what the Bible teaches about our identity, gender, sexuality, marriage, ministry. And there will be times, not all the time, when what the Bible says and what culture says don't match up and they don't line up. We have to ask ourselves, will we do what the King says or what we think is right? See, what characterized an entire period of time was that people continued to do what was right to them. Friends, can I tell you something? We are going to make mistakes. We'll come up short. We won't do things perfectly. But I want us to be characterized as a people who served the Lord and followed the King, not who did what was right in their own eyes. Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11 and 12, it reminds us of our position in the world today, that because we serve a king, we're different. This is what he says. Beloved, I urge you, as sojourners and exiles, to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. Our lives will look different than the rest of the world, and it will become more and more apparent and evident. We are thankful this morning for a God who is faithful, especially when we are faithless. So as we close this morning, just a couple things for you to be thinking about. Talking about one generation passing along to the next, that one generation served the Lord, the next generation didn't. If you're a parent here this morning, how are you passing your faith on to your children? Not that you can save them or have the power over that, but that you are modeling it for them each and every single day. If you're here and you're a follower of Jesus, you must continually seek out the idols that take up space in the corners of your heart. And Jesus will ask you, am I Lord over that? And the answer should be a resounding yes. Allow Him to continue to change your heart each and every single day, and in so become more like Him. Have you seen the judge's spiral in your own life? The reality of your sin and God's grace should spur you to praise Him and thank Him today. And a big question as we move forward. Look towards next week to Be Human. Do you see living among people who are not Christians? Do you see living in a post-Christian world and society as a problem or as a possibility? I hope it's the latter. We're going to pray, our team is going to sing, and we're going to be dismissed this morning. Jesus, thank you for your word. Lord, we know the entire Bible tells your story, and the book of Judges is ultimately about you. We don't live in a time when there is no king. We won't be left to our own devices. Jesus, we will serve you. Lord, help us to identify those idols in our heart, those things that take up space where they shouldn't, that we've allowed to become central in our lives. We serve you today. In your name, amen.